Welcome to Creative Piecemeal. I'm Tammy Takeishi, a board-certified music therapist. Join me each week as a new guest from across the fine and creative arts spheres shares struggles, triumphs, laughs, words of wisdom, and more in authentic, thought-provoking, and inspiring interviews. Hello and welcome to Creative Piecemeal. Today I am with legendary musician John McCutcheon. He has a new album out called Field of Stars, which I had the pleasure of listening to recently, and it is, if you're a fan of folk music, it is just beautiful, absolutely fantastic, excellent elemental storytelling. John at 72 is still amazing things, and please check out his back catalog as well. But so excited to have you on the show. Your bio, of course, lists many accolades, but I would love to talk about your latest project, and then we can get back into your origin story.
So, Field of Stars. This was an album that I was supposed to record back in 2020. I came back from a month-long tour in Australia in mid-March of that year. And of course, we all know what happened in mid-March 2020. It was really clear, even though I had booked studio time and I had hired musicians and we picked the songs, arrangements were being worked on, that, no one was going to go into a little windowless room with your best friends to play any music anytime soon. So I kind of put that on the shelf, figuring that when this pandemic thing was over in a couple of months, that we would get back to it. But I kind of hit a different kind of creative stride and ended up putting an album out a year for the last 5 years now. I wrote a lot during the pandemic. I mean, every other part of my job was gone. And it just gave me time to luxuriate in the craft. And I found new ways to write. And so when I finally, last year, I did an album of songs I'd co-written with Tom Paxton, who's talk about a legendary songwriter. He's a real icon. And so I thought, okay, it's time to get that old album off the shelf, dust off the songs, and finally get them out. And about half the songs still worked for me, the other half, not so much. And there was a lot of stuff written in the meantime. And so I was really thrilled to be able to give these songs some breathing room, hand them over to my co-collaborators in my studio guys who are way better musicians than I am. That's what you should do. And turn these little songs into something that ended up in people's hands.
Yeah. And I was instantly just, I was telling a friend when I heard your album that it felt very grounding. It felt like home, even though, it was new music to my ears. There was just something so, it's like pieces of me just came together. And, your voice is so it's like coffee and dark chocolate. It's just lovely. Absolutely lovely. I loved it. I was like, it resonated with me so much. And I'm not even a huge folk person, but it was evoking reminding me of the Peter, Paul, and Mary from back in the day, and just things that I really, really connect with. And so I remember emailing your agent going, yes, put him on. I couldn't wait to talk to you.
Oh, well, thanks. And it's always great to sort of road test your stuff on people who have no idea who you are and profess to not know much about folk music or think, well, I don't like folk music that much. When in fact, it's the root of all the world's music. And one of the things I was blessed with was growing up in a time when storytelling was, a real connective act. And so a lot of these songs tell stories. I weaned my listeners and my audiences long ago from thinking that every song is autobiographical, because it's not. The title cut, for instance, about the Camino de Santiago, tells the story of 4 different people walking this 1,000-year-old 500-mile pilgrimage from the Pyrenees of southwestern France to Santiago de Compostela. And Compostela translates to Field of Stars, hence the name of the song. And I just couldn't resist an album with such a beautiful title. And I'm actually walking the Camino this spring, but, we writers don't write from experience. Nikki Giovanni, the great poet who just left us, she said, writers don't write from experience. We write from empathy. And so being able to ask myself two things: what's the story in this song, and what's the voice? Who's telling this story? Those are my two, the two questions I begin every song with. And some of these songs are pulled from history. Some I just, made up out of thin air, because that's what writers do.
And I love that. I love that you explored your creative side and making things up, but also taking things that are based in, storytelling, and that you just, and it creates such a rich tapestry. And again, it's one of those things where like I may have heard a song you've written but didn't know it, kind of thing. Because
that's great. That's the essence of folk music. Somebody wrote John Henry, somebody wrote Barbary Allen, but the song was more important than the source. These days, people say, "Oh, that's a Kendrick Lamar song," or "That's a, Adele song," or "This is, an old Crow Medicine Show song." And you immediately impart value on it based on the personality, But really, I remember being in a workshop at a festival once, and the title of the workshop was Songwriters Sing Their Favorite Traditional Song. And they're going around the circle, and somebody sings one of my songs. And my buddy Stan Rogers was sitting next to me and said, "Hey, are you going to tell him or not?" I said, "No, shut up. This is like the greatest compliment in the world, to think that this song survived what traditional songs do." There were no videos. They were not written down. There was no, accreditation of who wrote it. It was just, is this a good song? Do I want to learn it? Do I want to sing it? And somebody else hears you do it, and it's like a giant game of telephone. Yeah, and there were important historical stories to tell. I'm a history buff, and of course, these days everybody thinks everything is happening for the very first time, when in fact a lot of stuff happened in the past, and we're lousy at history. So, for instance, the story of the MS St. Louis, the ship that brought or attempted to bring 900 Jewish refugees from Germany to North America in 1939, and was turned away everywhere. Cuba, Canada, the United States, and those people had to go back to this place where Hitler and death awaited them. And, I use that story to say, well, I'm thinking of the St. Louis as I read the news today. Another tale of refugees turned back and turned away, where after the first two verses, most normal people would say, "That's horrible. How could we have possibly let that happen?" Or the origins of the term redneck. Or, who's the third guy in that famous picture from the 1968 Olympics of John Carlos and Tommy Smith raising their fists on the award stand? I see that and I say, well, who's that guy? What was his story? What did he think about all this? And so it's a great opportunity to tell some stories that people might not know, and that, me in my hubris thinks that they ought to know.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
If you've been feeling burned out, stressed, overwhelmed, or exhausted, the resources and courses at the Self-Care Institute are here to support you. The Self-Care Institute was founded by Dr. Ami Kunimura and provides support for individuals and organizations with burnout prevention, burnout recovery, and stress management. I've personally taken a few of these courses and found them to be super helpful, both professionally and personally. The care you give yourself matters just as much as the care you give to others. But if self-care is difficult for you, you're not alone. And the Self-Care Institute is here to support your well-being, resilience, and sense of fulfillment at work and at home. For more information, visit selfcareinstitute.com or go to the show notes and click on the link. I think it's so important, especially, well, always important, but especially now, that people keep creating, keep songwriting, keep making sure that people know what happened in history, because of that old adage that you're doomed to repeat it, if you don't know it. But backtracking a little bit, how did you get into being a musician, being a songwriter? Is this what you always thought you would do in your life?
Oh, it's what I always wanted to do. Did I think I would do it? Hell no. You know, I was a kid. My first introduction to folk music was when I was 11. And my mother made me sit down and watch the March on Washington on television. She was a social worker before she became a mother and never lost that understanding that there's a bigger world waiting outside your door, and you're not doing your job as a parent if you don't prepare your kids for what they're going to run into when they walk out that door. And, you know, this was a great social movement, the civil rights movement. I grew up in a very religious family, so it ticked all the boxes. It was a righteous cause. It was led by clergy. They used biblical language. Let my people go. I will make it to the mountaintop, but I may not go with you. And the songs were repurposed hymns, just simply changing the singular to the plural, from I will overcome to we shall overcome, or I will not be moved to we shall not be moved. And then there was music. There was Peter, Paul, and Mary, who you referenced before, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Odetta, Len Chandler. And this was music that sounded old, but was very urgent. I mean, Bob Dylan sang a song about the death of Medgar Evers, which had just happened 2 months earlier. And you just thought, my little 11-year-old brain kind of exploded and said, you can write songs about the news, but it was connected to a bigger social movement. Yeah, I was a big fan of the Beatles. This is 1963, for heaven's sakes. You know, they're new on the block, and I'm listening to AM radio all the time, like every other 11-year-old. But this was different. This was really different. It sounded old and urgent, and it was connected to something bigger than itself. And so I got really interested in that and started a 3-year campaign along with my best friend who was bitten by the same bug to get a guitar. And I got a guitar for my 14th birthday and immediately started writing songs. I started writing really bad songs. Start out, you know, nobody's a genius. You know, I'd like to see Dylan's early catalog. But, and started playing, my best friend and I played at guitar masses, and we played at our high school talent shows and stuff like that. And I loved doing it. I went to college, started playing in the college coffee house, and friends of mine who graduated in the music education program had seen me in the coffee house and said, oh, why don't you come and play at my school for the kids? And boy, if you ever want to learn how to perform, try doing 6 45-minute assembly programs to a bunch of people who don't know who you are and didn't ask to see you. And your only competition is math class. And, you know, I put myself through college, $25 at a time, doing that kind of stuff. And it at the same time, I wanted to learn to play the banjo. And I was going to college in northern Minnesota, which is an awful place to try to learn to play the banjo. It's kind of the ultimate in cultural denial. And so I convinced my college advisor to let me do an independent study of hitchhiking around the Appalachians and meeting banjo players. And that's what I did starting at age 20. And I paid for that by playing in little church coffee houses and giving lessons and all the kinds of things that musicians do when they're starting off. But what really interested me in that academic independent study was not learning how to play the banjo. I mean, I did. But what was interesting to me was the way that music operated in a community, how it was instrumental rather than merely ornamental to community life. And it really felt like musicians had a job. Maybe they were playing in church or playing on a picket line, or you're going to have a pie supper and a cake walk to try to raise money so you can have a health clinic in your community. And all these ways in which musicians were seen as having some value. And growing up in this culture where, artists are either the elite or the insignificant, and you play by capitalism's rules. And folk music is a prime example. In the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, it was the big thing. And what the music industry does is it chews you up and spits you out and is hungry for the next big thing. But it's like all these other forms of music, it still survives on a much more grassroots level. And I felt more comfortable there. So I've been very lucky that for 50 plus years, I've been able to do a job I love and avoid ever having gainful employment. And then I get to play music that I love. I'm not in a cover band playing in bars. battling jukeboxes and pool tables and smoke. I get to play for people that are listening, and it has taught me to be more mindful of the songs that I write, that I'm inviting someone into a little 3.5 minute world, and I don't want to give them an opportunity to leave that world for any reason. So you have a story, you have a voice, and you try to get away all the pebbles in your shoe that will distract someone, like a bad rhyme or a stupid story. You want people to surrender to this moment. And luckily, I like people who taught me how to play the banjo. I found people whose songwriting I thought was really powerful and important. And I learned to play the banjo. I just sat on the sidelines and watched and imitated and made mistakes and got kicked in the butt by people who were kind enough to mentor me. And now I'm old enough, and every interview I do, it must be in the press release that I'm 72 years old. And amazing, he's still doing this job. It would be more amazing if I was a football player and still playing at 72. But, when we're done here, Tammy, I'm going to be writing with Tom Paxton, who's pushing 88 and is still writing great songs. I was lucky I fell into something I can do my whole life.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say, that's the amazing thing about being in the creative arts, is that as long as somebody can wake up in the morning and they have a passion for it, they can do it. It doesn't actually matter their age. I just think it's wonderful that people still choose to do it past a certain societal age point,
Yeah. And the biggest impediment that I have seen to people continuing in the creative arts is feeling like they failed to achieve what they hoped. I was lucky enough to come into the folk music world after it was a big thing. I kind of came into the backwater. There was no gold ring to reach for. It was just, hey, you get to play music you love. We'll give you audiences that will actually listen to you. And there's a camaraderie here that is really rich and enlivening and life sustaining. And this is your work. It's more than a job. It's your work. And so my buddy Tom Paxton, for instance, recently we would tour together, but recently he had some health stuff and he said, okay, I'm 87 years old. I've punched the clock plenty. I'm not touring anymore. But he's still being useful. I mean, good heavens, Pete Seeger was out at Occupy Wall Street to sing for the kids that were there when he was 94, tottering around on two canes because he wanted to be helpful. And it doesn't matter what your job is. You want to be helpful. You want to be helpful building a car or delivering the mail or teaching the kids or keeping the streets safe or clean. It's as much as you can work for, as much as you can hope for.
You talked a little bit about your songwriting and how you want to draw people in for the entirety of the song, but I would love to take a peek behind the curtain. What is your songwriting process? What is something that you love? What's something that you just wish you could rush through,
Oh, sometimes you do rush. There are some songs you write and some songs you just write down. And that's not peculiar to songwriting. I mean, many of your listeners, I'm sure, wrote a term paper or a letter to the editor or something, a sympathy card, or, something for their grandmother's birthday. And you write this down and you look at it and you say, whoa, this is really good. Where did this come from? My process tries to get to that point. One thing I discovered, because I had plenty of time to pay attention to it, was during the pandemic. I came back from Australia and I had to quarantine. I'd been overseas for a month. Hell, I was on a tubular petri dish for 24 hours flying home. God knows what I was bringing to the door. So my wife, who is also a writer, and I have a little cabin up in the North Georgia mountains. I live in the Atlanta area, where we go to write. So I went up there for 3 weeks. It was the only responsible thing to do. And I had no chores to do. I wasn't going to the grocery store. I wasn't going to the gym. I wasn't, going to the movies. I certainly wasn't going out on the road. So I just wrote. And every morning I would get up And I still do this. I meditate. There's prayer involved. I have poetry that comes into my inbox, my email box from the Paris Review and from the Writer's Almanac and from poetry.com. I read a bunch of stuff, Thomas Merton, Rilke, Mary Oliver, Wendell Berry, Brian Doyle. And it's all right brain stuff, right? It's like, I don't do the news, I don't do puzzles. It's just no left brain activity at all. There's nothing that's calculating. And then I would write. And it was as though I had completely opened myself up by all this stuff that I had to surrender to. You surrender in meditation, you surrender in prayer, you surrender when you're reading poetry. And then I would write. And I was ready to follow the lead of an idea. Sometimes it was a sound. I remember sitting on my porch there and a truck drove by and I heard tires crackle in the gravel because it's a gravel road. And I wrote down tires crackling in the gravel. And boom, I was off. And it was like I was on a wild horse. I was just holding on. And what it told me is that when you are learning a craft, whether it be a musical instrument, how to knit, how to sculpt, whatever, there is a period during which you learn basic technique. And then it's not that you stop learning technique, but art is not about control, it's about abandon. And I remember reading an article about Itzhak Perlman, the great violinist. And they asked him, as you kind of just asked me, what is your practice technique? And he said, I practice anywhere. I practice walking down the street. I practice on a plane. They said, you take your violin out on a plane? He says, no. The technical stuff, I got that. Got that long ago. Now it's all about interpretation. How am I going to think about how I want to play this? The written music is simply a recipe. And those people who can only follow the recipe are never going to have that soul enlivening experience of just saying, okay, how am I going to play this? How am I going to tell this story? Where is this story leading me? And I've learned that every character in my songs cannot and should not be a little avatar of me. They have their own voice and they're disobedient. They say things I wouldn't say. I wrote a song about what happened in Charlottesville back in August of 2017. And I wrote it through the eyes of a World War II veteran sitting on his front porch, watching Nazis walk by. I mean, the last thing he would ever think he would see after being at Normandy. And he just says, God damn them all to hell. And that's one of the lyrics. And a woman objected, saying, you can't say that in public. I said, I didn't. The guy how do you think he would react? That was his voice. And I had to let him have his own voice. It's way more interesting. I remember talking to the novelist Barbara Kingsolver, who I said, we were talking about writing. I said, so do you have a storybook, a storyline? And your latest novel, Demon Copperhead, did you have a storyboard that you were writing to? She said, no. It's way more fun to turn the page with the reader. As the poet Billy Collins said, your pen can be a dictation device or it can be a flashlight. Having it be a flashlight is way more interesting. So that's a little bit about how I start writing a song. Some things are much more intentional. There's a specific story, like the Battle of Blair Mountain in the song Redneck. There were historical things, and there's a museum in Matewan, West Virginia, that I wrote that in honor of the centenary of the Battle of Blair Mountain. It happened in 1921. So there were certain historical things I wanted to get right, but I told it through the eyes of one of the participants who's going to have a peculiar point of view. So that's the attempt to merge, factual things that I want to tick off and yet expand upon them through the eyes of an actual participant. I don't know if that's a lot of talking for a simple question, but
I love that, though. I love that you give such rich answers. And I mean, I don't know about my listeners, but I feel like I could. This is one of the things I love about podcasting. I feel like it's collecting pieces of history from amazing artists. And maybe one day someone's going to look back and be like, oh, I can't wait to listen to this episode and hear what this person has to say at this point in time, because it's like living history, you know? And I love the perspective that you bring to it.
Well, and everybody sort of deals with things in their own way. And I guess I was set out on this particular path because when I got that guitar at age 14, finally, it was a Sears and Roebuck Silvertone guitar, and it cost $29.95. And it was the most expensive gift that anyone in our family had ever received, including my mother. And I know that because she told me. And so I knew better than to assume that maybe they would get me lessons. I knew I was on my own, so I went down to the library, as I was wont to do. I needed information. I had no money. That's what there was. And I went to the card catalog, and the only listing under guitar was this book called Woody Guthrie Folk Songs. And Woody Guthrie, for your listeners, is the fellow who wrote This Land Is Your Land, as well as almost 3,500 other songs. And the first page of this book was chord grids. You know, if your listeners who play a musical instrument, like a guitar or a mandolin or a banjo, know what those grids look like. It shows you where to put your finger on what fret, on what string. And I thought, oh, cool, this is a guitar instruction book. But in fact, it was just a songbook of this guy, and he wrote love songs and kid songs and historical songs and funny songs and angry songs and topical songs. And what I didn't realize is not only was I learning to play the guitar by learning these songs, but I was also starting to understand what the writer's job was, which was primarily simply to pay attention and to try to tell the truth and tell stories. And so it was inevitable that I would kind of end up doing this kind of stuff. I mean, I write symphonic stuff. I write instrumentals. And I did when my children, two of whom live near you in Brooklyn, were little kids, I wrote 8 albums worth of kid songs. So it's, you know, I've been all over the map, but this feels like this is my job right now, to tell little stories, and some of them have import, and some of them are just sweet little things about a couple who dances through their entire life, never cared that they were the only ones dancing. They were just, this was their way of connecting. So, it was inevitable that I would end up doing this. It's Woody's fault.
Gosh darn it, Woody. I love that, though. I love that you took it upon yourself to just discover something and, you know, not let your circumstance hold you back. And shout out to libraries, you know.
Yeah, we're talking in February, and this is Love Your Library Month. And every public library has a Friends of the Library, and also every county library system probably has a foundation that tries to raise money, because as you can imagine, libraries are going to be a real target for all these billionaires cutting government spending. And so a lot of what happens in your local libraries comes from private donations through library foundations. So I was on the DeKalb County, Georgia Library Foundation board for many years and still contribute because, you know, libraries are still, you know, whether you go or not, you'd be amazed at how many people can't afford books. They can't afford the big bestseller. They can't afford magazine and newspaper subscriptions. Remember magazines and newspapers? And they go to the library. It's a surprising number of people, their only internet connection is at the library. That's where they plan vacations. That's where they apply for jobs. It's where they apply for government benefits. So yeah, a little, you know, diversion here to supporting public libraries.
Yeah. One thing, and I love that you diverted. One thing that I love about some libraries now is they start having where you can check out things. You can check out musical instruments. You can check out hardware tools if you needed to like fix something at your house, and I just love that it's expanded to that.
Right. And, not everybody needs a lawnmower. Not everybody needs a snowblower. Not everybody needs a circular saw. So expanding that notion, and there are libraries for skills, I can come and build a set of stairs for you if you will, mend this big pile of clothes that I have no idea how to do. So it's creating a different kind of economy in communities. I mean, this is exactly what a lot of people would like to not have happen. This kind of expansive thinking of, well, not everybody has to own every single thing. Let's figure out a way that we can share it. I love that. I have watched this. I was on a chair of a board of a Nicaraguan children's literacy program many years ago. And we were setting up mobile libraries because they really couldn't afford them. And they had quickly expanded to tools. I can't afford a hammer, but I can go to the library and check one out. So, yeah, it's a great thing.
A little longer on the topic of books, what is one that you read recently that challenged you, and then a book that you come back to over and over?
Oh, the book I come back to over and over is easy, Prince of Tides. It is one of the most delicious books I've ever read. I luxuriate over the language. And in fact, it's my 42-year-old son's favorite book. And for Christmas one year, I got him a signed copy by Conroy. And my wife is rereading it right now. A book that challenged me. I'm right now in reading Niall Williams's The Year of the Child. He's an Irish writer. The first book that I read of his was called This Is Happiness. Set in a small village in Ireland that's going through electrification. And like Conroy, his language is just stunning. And as a writer myself, you read so many books that are just kind of beige or vanilla. And it's like, okay, well, it was a really good story, but the writing was, kind of reportage rather than literature. And the thing that challenged me about Williams's books, and all of them that I've read, this is the third book of his I read, is like I find myself rereading paragraphs 2 and 3 times. Not that I didn't understand them, but that it was like eating a piece of delicious dessert. Language was just beautiful. And also Amor Towles, who wrote A Gentleman in Moscow.
I love him.
And I've read everything that he's written. And like Prince of Tides, the movie that Barbra Streisand made was so disappointing. Don't watch it, people. Read the book. The book is fabulous, and the music and the movie is horrible. There's a television series now called Our Gentleman in Moscow, which is totally different from the book.
It is quite different, yeah.
Well, or All the Light We Cannot See, which was another fabulous book. They did an adaptation for television or streaming. That was completely different from but that's, I remember my eldest son, who loved Tolkien. And so he was older. He was in his 20s when the movies came out. And I said, what do you think? He said, well, the movies were actually really good, but not anywhere near as good as the books. And so it's kind of like what music does. It, especially somebody like Tolkien, takes you into a world that is created very intentionally and very intricately and just holds you there the whole time. The books that do that, the songs that do that, the plays, the films, the sporting events that do that are fantastic. So I think, we all trudge through our everyday worlds and hope that, and look for those places where we can go. And maybe sometimes it draws you more entirely into the world as it is today and wrestles with these demons that we all have to wrestle with. At its best will give you a new idea, because how often does that happen? That's one of the things I love about my morning rituals is I'm marinating in these great ideas that have been around since we had ideas. And then I watch the news and I think, what puny ideas these people have. And they're, it's distracting, intentionally distracting. And it's meant to produce fear and anger. And that's just counterproductive, undemocratic, and wrong.
I would agree. I would love to talk a little bit more about the creative process. I love that you meditate and that you tap in and tune in every morning and you have a routine. But I imagine that sometimes you probably come against maybe creative barriers or the well's a little shallow sometimes. Maybe you're getting over an illness or you're tired and things aren't coming, flying fast the way you want. What are some ways that you reconnect when you're wanting to be creative and it's sort of stuck?
Well, I realize that things like writer's block actually exist. I'm really fortunate that I've never suffered from that because I write so regularly. And I also, this medium, Zoom, is a fantastic way of doing co-writing, which is something that a lot of us turn to do, maybe not knowing that's what we were going to do. I remember discovering that Zoom could be used for good as well as evil during the pandemic, and just getting in touch, for instance, with my buddy Tom Paxton, so that I'd have somebody to talk to and somebody I knew who liked to tell jokes and liked to talk sports. And, we would make up funny shit about the state of the world and what some ridiculous thing so-and-so said. And then one day it was like, you want to try writing a song? Because in the past, you had to be in the same room. And that was nigh impossible for those of us who tour for a living. The last thing we're going to tell our loved ones is, hey, I'm just back from a tour, but I'm going to go up to Washington and hang with Tom Paxton for 4 or 5 days. So I write with 5 or 6 people every week via this medium. And to me, it's like going to the songwriting gym. My muscles are completely activated. I'm in shape. So one thing, I do these songwriting camps every summer. And at the end of every camp, these 20 people have been in this incredibly intense and rich environment where you're eating, breathing, sleeping, songwriting for 5 days straight. And it's the last morning, and some of them are just thinking, oh my gosh, this has been incredible, but I'm going home where I'm not going to be around this at all. What do I do to keep the juices flowing? And I usually say, okay, just make a promise to yourself that you're going to write every day. Pick a time, pick a spot. Maybe it's a chair in the corner. Maybe it's a Chase lounge out on your patio or your deck, or if you're in an apartment building, go up on the roof. And that's the place you write. And make it sacred, and make the people with whom you share your environment understand this is important. This is not just a hobby. And every day at, 5 o'clock, 7 p.m., whatever's convenient for you, go there every day for 2 weeks and write. You don't have to have anything in mind. Just go there and sit. You don't have to finish anything. It doesn't even have to be a song. Just write. And it'll seem laborious when you start, but little by little, it's going to get easier. And at the end of those 2 weeks, if you feel like, oh, this is great, I'm all juiced up. No, give yourself another week. And at the end of that week, evaluate it. Give yourself another week. And it really, the number one rule I tell my songwriting students, the number one rule is ass in chair. It's all about showing up and doing it. And, the muse is fickle, and this isn't about fairy dust. This isn't about some great revelation. Sometimes you'll have that, but it's about doing the work. I went through a period where I just read through the newspaper every day, and I would look at the headlines. And I was in an area where the Washington Post was the daily that was arriving at my doorstep. Yes, a real newspaper. And they often had whoever wrote their headlines was very clever. And I would, every day I'm going to grab one headline and I'm going to write about that. Where is it taking you? So that's what I suggest to people, that they double down, that they actually sit down, right. It doesn't have to be good. I mean, heavens, if you were a baseball player and you only got on base 3 times out of 10, you would be a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame. That's how much you got to get used to failure and writing crap, because you got to write crap. It's in there. It's going to come out. And it's what teaches you. You know, I'm an old athlete. I played all sports through all my academic years. And it sounds like a corny cliche, but it's absolutely true that you learn a lot more from failure than you do from success.
Very true. Very true. I also songwrite, and it's something that I've gotten back into in the last several months. And I've discovered that having a specific place to physically write like lyrics and chord thoughts down has been so integral. And I got a songwriting journal as a Christmas gift. And it was one of those things where it really allowed me to tap into that creative side, because, you know, it's one thing to just type out lyrics on your phone, you know, in a flash, but to physically handwrite it, there's a permanence. There's something special about that, you know?
Oh, I have to start writing on a yellow legal pad. And in fact, I was doing a recording session in Nashville about a week ago, and the engineer on his iPad had what looked like a yellow legal pad. And he was actually writing stuff with the digital pen on the iPad. And I thought, well, okay. I mean, it's the same thing, really. But yeah, there's a process that will work for you. And one thing, you know, after Ask and Share is write it down. You know, everybody I know has had a great idea. They wake up in the middle of the night and they'll say, I'll remember that in the morning. And nobody has not had that. And you will lose it. You will lose it. So you have to understand that this is a gift. You can develop it, but when stuff like that comes to you, it's a gift, and you got to, you know, create a methodology, whether it be, okay, I got to dictate this idea into my phone right now, or I've got to write it in there, or I'm going to walk around with a little spiral pad in my pocket and just write this stuff down. It's a process you have to understand and respect. It's kind of like when I was teaching my kids to use power tools. I said, never take you have to respect this, because this is a tool, but it can hurt you. Same thing with writing. You know, you can get better at it, and just respect it and be grateful for it.
I know for myself, sometimes I will write poems, and sometimes I will write things that are distinctively song lyrics. And sometimes they can interchange, but occasionally, like, the poem is the poem and that's it. Are you ever that kind of a writer? Like, do you actually have poems that will never become songs because that's just the way that they were made?
Well, never is a big word. And I have written poems that I have turned into songs. They became different things. And in fact, I was just doing an online show last night in which I wrote a song based almost verbatim on a phone conversation I had with my father when he was in an Alzheimer's facility. It didn't rhyme, and it was only my side of the conversation. But it was revealing, you know, I was responding to him so the listener could understand what was going on the other end of the phone. And that's one of the things I like about both poetry and songwriting. And again, I encourage my students to let the listener do some of the work. You know, it's not just like you have to be completely literal, but you have to leave enough breadcrumbs out there so that the listener becomes invested. And, you know, people understood what I was hearing, even though they weren't hearing it in this phone conversation. So I thought it was a poem, but I put a melody to it, and nobody said, well, that doesn't rhyme. It doesn't have a meter. It just has words and a melody. So you can do it with a lot of different things. I started off writing poetry. Well, I started off writing really bad songs. And then I started writing poetry, which felt to me like a very different thing. There were rules in songwriting. There was meter, there was rhyme, it couldn't be 7 minutes long. And, you know, light my fire and MacArthur Park and American Pie blew that out of the water. But yeah, I mean, I still write poetry that I don't intend to turn into a song. And every once in a while, I'll look at a poem and say, that could maybe be a song, or I'd like to sing that.
Just a couple more questions for you. What is something that you wish you knew when you started on your creative journey?
Well, I certainly didn't know what a rich community I was going to be entering. And I didn't know really I was going to end up as a songwriter. I thought I was just simply going to be a musician. I mean, you commented on my studio here. When I perform, I play 6 or 7 different instruments on the stage. They're all related. They're all string instruments. And they all sort of come out of the Appalachian experience, which is what I imbued myself with starting in the early 1970s and have never left that. So I really thought, and my reputation early on was, well, if you need a fiddle player, call John McCutcheon. Or if you need somebody who can play dot, dot, and dot on your recording project, hiring him is like hiring 3 people. So I really thought that was going to be my go-to. I didn't think that I would ever turn into a respectable singer, but I had to pay attention to singing in much the same way I paid attention to learning to play a musical instrument, because your voice is a musical instrument. I wish I knew how long I would be doing this and all the amazing people that I would meet along the way. And these days, every week, I lose someone else. It's the price of a long life. Tammy, you're going to live a long life, and 50 years from now, you'll know what I'm talking about. But understanding that love is the mother of grief, and you can't have one without the other. And it's the price of admission. You pay it when they leave.
So true. So true.
And I wish I would have known how much I would love being a dad and especially being a grandfather. I mean, when you're young, you think about, I could be a father. Sure, I can see that. But I never had a really close relationship with my grandparents. And I love the fact that I married into a multi-generational family where everybody was a part of everyday life. And, I lived with my in-laws lived with my wife and I. And, there were 4 generations at the Thanksgiving table. And it was just such a rich experience. So I didn't know that, and I didn't know I was going to talk to you.
All beautiful things. Excellent. Well, John, thank you so much for joining the podcast. Listeners, please check out the show notes where you can find where to purchase and stream his latest album as well as past albums. As always, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Creative Piecemeal. We hope today's episode left you feeling inspired. This podcast is independently created and produced by the host, Tammy Takaishi. More details about today's guest can be found in the show notes, along with links to the podcast's socials, merch store, and ways to support arts organizations AHA Broadway and New Normal Rep, both near and dear to Tammy's heart. Don't forget to visit creativepiecemeal.com, the official podcast website, where you can leave fan mail, write a review, explore Tammy's blog, and discover the growing collection of episodes. Special thanks to our audio engineer, Alex Rapetti. Additional narration by Dante Jace. Let's keep celebrating creativity in all its forms.